I'm Craig Constantine. Welcome to the Movers Mindset Podcast, where I talk with movement enthusiasts to learn who they are, what they do, and why they do it. My guest today is David Wilson. Welcome, David. How are you this afternoon?
Yes, it is this afternoon where I am, as it is where you are. And thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
No, you're more than welcome. You did what I love most, which is when I message people and instead of responding, you just booked. It's like my favorite kind of person. I'm like, yes. And I love with this particular show, I had a guest, I think it was like in late 2023, who mentioned you. He said, "Oh, I follow this guy on Instagram and you got to see his content." So I've been like lurking your Instagram feed for a year.
Oh, that's
Um,
you, is it? Okay, all
yeah.
right.
So I push your numbers up all the time.
Mhm.
I'm we're like generally the same cohort, and we don't have to play the age cards. But there was the I'm going to say your anti-ageism is the part that really makes me want to like leap out of my chair and flip my desk over. Like hell yes, more of that. I was just at a parkour class yesterday with a bunch of people who are half my age, and I somehow seem to have gotten over the hurdle of I'm not self conscious anymore about being in public spaces and moving or being with people who can like do everything bigger, better, more than me. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are around how do we get more people who aren't necessarily couch potatoes, but just people who are afraid or have that self-critical eye. Like, how do we get more people to move beyond the worrying about what people are thinking about them and simply being who they are and moving? Does that make sense?
Now, that's a very complicated question because it comes down to a lot of the narratives that we have internalized. And so confronting those narratives and doing a little bit of a reality check around them, I think, is very, very important, which means that it's not just the responsibility of the individual, it is the responsibility of us all. So you mentioned my anti-ageism advocacy. We start internalizing ageist messages and behaving in ageist ways as early as 4 years old. So by the time we get to middle age and beyond, we are very, very good at treating ourselves differently as older people and thinking about ourselves differently as older people than we might have thought of ourselves as younger people. So, one of the greatest misconceptions around aging in regard to movement is that aging is a death sentence for movement.
Hmm.
So, this idea that because I'm growing older, maybe I should slow down. Maybe I'd better not try that difficult thing because maybe I'm too old to learn. Or maybe I'll get hurt, or so many of the other things that we believe as we get older. I've heard 30-year-olds talk about uh, now that they have a bad knee because they're 30. Well, what about their other knee? It's also 30 years old, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? So, in the vast majority of cases, motion is lotion and movement is
Yes.
medicine. And it's not that easy, though, when we're afraid of movement because we live in a culture that is largely movement phobic, where the minute we begin to feel an ache or a pain, the advice is stop moving. We'll get it from our friends, we'll get it from our family, especially as we get older. We get it from well meaning friends and families. Oh, just slow down. Like maybe you better not do that anymore, or just take it easy at your age. All of these messages are so prevalent around us, and they're prevalent in the images that we see of older people, where the images that we see of older people simply do not represent reality. So one of the things that I would suggest that people do is begin to actually look at older people, all older people, not just the ones who conform to the stereotype of the frail little old woman or the frail little old man. Also think for a moment that when we are 20 years old, Do we think of ourselves in the same way that we might think of somebody who was 50 years old or 60 years old? Probably not.
Right.
And yet, most of us, if we are lucky enough to be living in certain places in the world with this kind of life expectancy, when I start moving into old age, so depends on how you define that. So, in some people's minds, that would be 55. In some people's minds, it would be 60, 65, whatever. How do I think of myself? Or how does the world see me? And typically, we're all lumped into the same category of old, which is like putting a 20-year-old in the same category as a 50-year-old. Because you're looking at a 60-year-old or a 55-year-old being basically in the same category as an 85-year-old or a 95-year-old. So one of the things that is very interesting about us as we grow older is we grow more different from each other. So there is uh, a greater span of being, a greater range of being in your older years than there is in your younger years. So you put two 4-year-olds beside each other, and because they're only 4 years old and they haven't had the influence of
Right.
life experience and all of those different cultural influences, socioeconomic influences, histories of injury, the influence of genetics, all of that. Two 4-year-olds are very much more similar than two 40-year-olds. And two 40-year-olds are much more similar than two 65-year-olds. So the older we grow, the more different we become. Now, I know that I've wandered off your original question here,
Not really. I think
but
you're doing great.
I think that it is incredibly important for us to look at how we look at aging.
Hmm.
So, a friend of mine who literally wrote the book on aging and anti ageism began her book by talking about how just about everything that we think we know about growing older is wrong because it is so influenced by a profoundly ageist culture. So the
Yes.
very fact that we have health and wellness industries that are built multi-billion dollar industries that are built on the idea of anti-aging.
Yeah. I want to stick a pin.
Whereas, yeah,
Tell me
go
the
ahead.
title of the book. Are you talking about This Chair Rocks? Whose author?
No, 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 no. That would be another good friend of mine, Ashton Applewhite.
What's the
But
name of the book that you were first mentioning?
Okay, so the book that I was first mentioning is by Tracy Gendron, and the book title is Ageism Unmasked.
Because I want to just make sure that I get all this stuff in so people hear it and go, there's going to be book links in the show notes for people to dig up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you were just talking about how people create people bury's not the right word. People like sneak in anti-aging with the wellness industry. And the first thing that I thought of when you started talking about the wellness industry is I was just on a coaching call, like a call of people who are taking a coaching certification. And everybody on the call is young because those are the people who have the energy to work the 70-hour work weeks to build the business. And they're talking about how do we get more older people involved. And I'm like, well, the first problem you have is if everybody who works and runs the space is 20, I don't feel as an older person that you are going to have the right empathic and compassionate skill set to understand my journey. And I think that's like a double that cuts both ways.
Oh,
That sort
yeah.
of doesn't that sort of
So,
exclude like you're the guy or
mm,
maybe me, like we should be the ones somehow showing other people our own age, but
yeah,
then do we have the time to make
to
that
a
business?
degree, to a degree. So, because I'm also an anti-ageism advocate, I need to call you on something. So, what you just said was ageist, not against older people, but against younger people. So, ageism cuts both ways. So, it is being judged for something over which I have no control and does not necessarily at all influence who I am or my capacity to
Hmm.
do something. So, for example, depending on their background, depending on their personality, depending on their experience, a younger person can show just as much compassion and understanding of what it means and enter the imaginative space of what it means to be an older person as vice versa. So there's one of the things that I push back against all the time is the whole idea of old is wise, because that places a whole bunch of pressure on people to be wise as they get
That's a
older. And
good
I know
point.
a whole bunch of people who are older who are not at all wise.
Or
And I know a
might not
whole
want the
bunch of
role, right?
people, yeah, and I know a whole bunch of people who are younger who have tremendous wisdom. So you can already see that this confronting of ageist attitudes and beliefs is incredibly subtle, and it's everywhere. So I just was at the grocery store about 45 minutes before I hopped on the call with you, and I have a friend whose birthday is coming up, and it took quite an effort for me to find a birthday card for my friend who is in her 60s that was not insulting or ageist in some way.
I can just picture exactly what those cards are, right?
Mhm.
You know exactly what they look like.
Yeah. And so of course, to get back to your original question, how do we encourage more people, more older people to get involved? So here's now I know it took me a long time to get there, but sometimes the on ramp is worth spending some time on.
I like the scenic route. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. We need to be ambassadors of hope rather than minions of fear. So, what I hear so much in fitness contexts is, well, if you don't do this, then this terrible thing is going to happen to you as you grow older. And it's also very future focused rather than looking at movement as the great gift it is. The great gift it is that offers us all sorts of benefits right here and right now. It also means confronting and helping people to see that what they have been told about what it means to be growing older is more the influence of sedentary culture than and lifestyle choices and habits and all of those things, much more the result of those things
Hmm.
than um, than the simple fact of accumulating years. So I'm very lucky in some ways and not so lucky in others in that I didn't come to this journey as an athlete. I was never a gym rat. Nobody would have called me active until I was in my 50s. So I was a high school creative writing, critical thinking, and English language and literature teacher. So I would spend long hours standing, so not really moving around, standing, moving around in the classroom more than a bit, but certainly not doing anything that would be called in any way, shape, or form active in the
Yeah, and it's a
classroom.
specific singular movement
Yeah,
pattern. You're always doing
exactly,
the same thing.
exactly. And then as a teacher, I would come home at night. I would spend long hours at the computer prepping for the following day, or long hours at the dining room table marking student papers. And then because I like to read as often as not, I would fall onto the couch with the book at
The
the end of
book.
the day. So this was not exactly the most active of lifestyles, right? Now, I did know that I should keep myself busy and try to remain somewhat active, but I was what I would call, I don't know, a serial enthusiast. I'd pick up something for a month, a week, and sometimes even just a couple of days
Hmm.
before the romance began to wear off. And to a large degree, that was my own perfectionist mindset. I also call myself a recovering perfectionist in that I felt that if I couldn't do it,
Amen.
yeah,
Once more.
that if I
I'm working on it.
if I couldn't do it relatively quickly, then I believed that I really couldn't do it at all. So here we go again
Hmm.
with stories that get in the way of us doing the things that we actually could really enjoy and benefit from doing. So that was one of my stories, the perfectionist story. And then in my basically trying a whole bunch of things on. Eventually, I fell into a studio that recognized what I was doing in my head. And so their approach toward movement had a lot to do with inviting me to examine the things that were between my ears and to notice the stories that I had. And to, instead of meeting, trying to meet this kind of ideal version of myself who could do all of the things right away, meeting myself instead exactly as I am. And giving myself time and space and grace to explore that person and what might be possible, rather than comparing myself to everybody else, which, by the way, as we get older, because of all of these toxic ageist narratives, all of a sudden we really, really want to improve ourselves. We really want to prove ourselves as, well, I'm whatever age I am, and I can still do this, and I can do it just as well as you. And you know, that kind of comparison really doesn't serve anybody very well at any age, because it prevents us from being curious about who we are and who we might like to become, and instead puts us in the space where we're doing something for, I don't know, some type of imaginary external approval, because most of the
Yeah,
time nobody's looking at us anyway.
that's the
Nobody's
thing.
looking at us anyway. They're too.
Imaginary
Yeah,
external approval. I mean,
yeah.
occasionally, you get like a straight toes to toes, and that's even worse. Um, you've touched on a couple different things. One of them, which you didn't say explicitly, but I'm like reading in the story here, is you're very autodidactic. Like you're very interested in learning. So you're the sort of person who is going to find a question and then go seek the answer. And so I'm that way. When I couple that with goals, things get nasty. And I was reading, I don't know how far back I went in the timeline, but I was reading a post that you wrote about letting go of or your personal journey, getting away from concrete goals with timelines. Because I think people who are, it's not about being smart, it's about being like driven and curious by questions. If you're driven and curious by questions, then it doesn't take you long to come up with a neat challenge for yourself. And
Hmm.
then you quickly find oh, here's the path it looks like I should take. And then
Yeah.
you set yourself up for this, like, and then I got to draw the line of progress from here to there. It took me a long time to realize that that's not a good idea, that I really need to, if you have a question, just go explore the question in the movement space. And maybe the question for today is, I don't know, I'm not feeling curious. Maybe I'll just go move and a question will come up. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about
Mhm,
maybe your personal journey. I'm going to say escaping from goal setting, or if you
mhm.
want to phrase that differently.
I wouldn't say that I have entirely escaped from it, but it's simply not the priority. So I think it's okay to have goals. Goals are a way of having kind of a loose plan, and that's not a bad thing. Um, where I think goals start being not so useful is when they become things that we have to do, even though we ourselves might be changing in relationship to them, or even though the people in our lives might be changing and have different needs of us. So I can still have very loose movement goals. And mine are very, very loosely defined and absolutely no timelines. And just something that I can't resist saying, there is no linear progression toward a goal. It's all the
Right.
it's all the twirly whirly, right? So, as far as my pursuit of goals is concerned, it's embracing the twirly whirliness of looking at a goal. So I have replaced as my guiding goal, as my guiding principles, basically, not just in movement but in life. And this is one of the things that I say all the time in what I post. Life is movement, movement is life. And in my life, as in my movement, it's my values that matter.
Hmm.
So the problem with goals is they often ask us to show up exactly the same way every single day. And they expect us maybe not even to show up exactly the same way, but maybe to have improved a little overnight. But I don't show up the same way every day. I may have had a fight with my girlfriend. I may have not had enough water to drink. I may have not had enough sleep. I might have eaten something that kept me up the night before. I might have a tax bill that is
Something on your
bothering
mind,
me,
right?
something on my mind. And all of this is going to influence how I show up. So the question is, what kind of values do I bring to my practice? Because I see people who are generally very compassionate, kind people show up in their own movement practice, and I would not want to
Right.
have them as my
Self
coach
compassion. Yes. No,
in the
self
way
compassion is
in the
hard.
yeah in the way that they're treating themselves. Whoa,
Yeah.
it's really really tough. So really, what are my values? Because here's the thing, how we show up for ourselves is also how we show up in the world and how we show up with each other. So I mean, I can't be the compassionate person that I would like to be to the degree that I would like to be unless I can demonstrate that compassion toward myself. Because compassion's hard, and it's really hard toward ourselves. So if I can show that compassion toward myself, and this doesn't mean, by the way, taking it easy on myself. Sometimes the most compassionate thing that I can do is to challenge myself
Just do the
around
work.
why I want
Right.
to take it easy and instead not give myself a little bit of a pass on that day. So it's this idea of being aware of what I am experiencing and meeting that experience rather than pretending that I'm going to show up exactly the same way every day and bringing my values to bear on that experience. So I'm practicing being the human being that I want to be, being the man that I want to be every single moment of my movement practice. And sometimes I do better than others, but I also accept myself as being human in that process. And I say, oh, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? So it's all really just information. So anything that I notice in my practice, it's just information. So it doesn't have necessarily a positive or a negative. It's just information. And then I can do with that information what I will.
That's multi-thousand-year-old. I don't know who said it first, if it was Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, but the whole your perspectives, your perceptions, your analysis is where the error is made, not in the observation itself. There's a layer that I add, and when I make a judgment about the thing, that's where my mistake comes from.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm wondering if you've seen people, for people that you've seen make that transition from maybe from the sedentary lifestyle to a more active lifestyle, or they make that blossoming of the curiosity shift and they begin to move more. Do they, do you find that people make that shift because they were inspired by someone, or do
No,
they make that shift
no, 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 not at all. They make the shift because they've experienced it. So, one of the things that is incredibly important, especially for trainers and people who work with anybody of any age, is to give people a sense of can. So, this is what I mean about being an ambassador of hope rather than a minion of fear. So I don't care how, as a trainer, easy it looks like to you and how you feel that the person in front of you is not going to be challenged by it. Maybe the most important thing for that person in that moment is to get a sense of, wow, I can do this. So I have a client right now who has been working with me for just over a year, so really not very long at all. And she was having real fear about going up the 10 steps that it took her to get from um, sidewalk level up to the door of the post office. And we began with one step. And actually, we didn't even begin with with going up a step. We began with um, teaching her to stabilize on one leg, just a
Mm.
little more and a little bit more, and then maybe bring a little bit more of a balance challenge in it, and maybe a little bit more understanding of how to transfer weight. Well, she just hiked around Death Valley with her daughter, and this is 1 year later, but it didn't come from being afraid of the stairs to Death Valley. It came from, oh yeah, I can do this challenging thing. Now I can do this thing that is challenging for me, and I can get better at it. So it's meeting people where they are, or if it's you, starting where you are, rather than with an imaginary version of yourself as a younger person,
Mm.
where you're going to get hurt either emotionally or physically, and you're going to give up. So one of my big suggestions, first of all, given that time is a big issue for just about everybody, it's the most common excuse for not bringing movement into your life,
Yeah,
is
they mention I have to set aside 20 minutes and I never get to it because it takes too much time.
no, and
Yeah.
this is ridiculous, and it is actually reinforced by some of the guidelines that we've all heard. 2.5 hours a week of moderate to vigorous physical activity, and
15-minute warm up and cool down.
yeah, and there should be 2 days that involve load or resistance training. Oh, and by the way, you should be doing balance as well. Well, all of that is true. But there's a 2025 study that I just read of over 20,000 people aged 40 to 79, and women who engaged in, wait for it, 3.4 minutes. Minutes of intense activity reduced their risk of heart attack by 45% when compared with inactive women. And men who actually didn't exercise but just managed 5.6 minutes that would be characterized as bouts of physical activity throughout the day. Similarly, were able to reduce their risk of cardiac events and stroke. So, yeah, like that 2.5 hours a week, that's great if you can do it all. But something's better than nothing. And a little really, really, really does go a long way. So, I mean, one of the things that I suggest, again, as an ambassador of hope, is how do we make things possible for people? Well, first of all, they shouldn't have to go to a gym. They should be able to do it in their own home. You shouldn't need any specialized equipment. You shouldn't need any particular clothing, or whatever sometimes we are led to believe we need. All we need is a couple of minutes, and we need maybe an idea of some of the types of activity that are going to give us the biggest bang for our buck. But we also need to do things that we think we can do, and we can use very much also an understanding of what is likely to work for us and what isn't, to match our own goals. So, for example, I gave a talk for Road Scholar, which is a nonprofit out of the US that specializes in travel and education, largely for older people. It used to be called Elder Hostel. And they wanted me to talk about what it means to age well. Well, one of the things that I talked about there was how frequently when people, when they're, in their, sometimes as early as their 40s, sometimes in their 30s, 40s, 50s. So they plan this trip and then they think, oh my God, I'm not physically prepared for this trip. So, they get out the exercise bike that they bought during COVID, and
Drag it out of the closet, right?
yeah, they drag it out of the closet, and they take it for a spin a few times. And they're doing this to do things like improve their balance, or be able to be stronger to lift things into the overhead compartment or carry their luggage or whatever. Well, of course, spinning on an exercise bike might, if I'm going fast enough, help with a little bit of cardiovascular endurance, but only if I'm going fast enough. But it's certainly not going to help me lift things into the overhead
No.
compartment, or walk over cobblestones, or catch my balance, or do any number of the other things that people are fearful of when they begin to contemplate travel in unfamiliar places, in environments that are less engineered than the environments that we typically find ourselves in here in North America, where I live.
Hmm.
So, of course, then people get discouraged. And they think, well, wow, I spent all of this time on this stupid
Stupid
exercise bike,
bicycle, right?
and I still couldn't lift my luggage into the overhead compartment. And you know what? I was on those cobblestones in Siena, and I fell. So, you know, that exercise bike, it's going out in the trash the minute I get back. Well, when in fact, if they had a better understanding of
Yeah, what the
how,
demands were going to
yeah,
be. Like, what's the actual environment?
and how physical training works, how we have to be specific about it, how if I want to improve my balance in a dynamic environment where I'm moving, I need to be moving in balance. I actually can't even just be standing on one foot, staring at a fixed point in front of me, because that's not how I'm going to lose my balance
Yes.
when I am walking in Siena and taking photographs.
Yeah, in a crowd on a
Right?
slope with cobblestones.
Exactly.
I've actually
Exactly.
walked there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's we live in a culture that does not talk about these things very much. I mean, the same idea around um, how people go for the most commonly prescribed form of exercise for older people. They go for a walk,
Walk.
and they go for a walk around the block, and they go for the same walk, pretty much taking the same route, taking it at the same speed every day. And maybe to begin with, they improve a little bit, and then they stop improving because they've found their new baseline, but they keep doing the same thing, expecting further improvement to happen, but it doesn't happen. And then, of course, it gets discouraging and they stop. Where if only they had just a smidgen more understanding around how, if we expect to continue to build capacity, or be curious about building capacity, then we have to do a little something something a little bit more. Like, we need to maybe go a little faster, or maybe go a little further, or maybe move in a more complex environment, or maybe, you know have one foot off the curb and one foot
Foot on the
on for
street.
part of it, or
Yeah.
any number of things that are now going to ask my body to do something a little different, because our bodies thrive on this variety, because our bodies are incredibly cooperative, as you know. They will give us more of what we ask them to do, but they are tremendously efficient. And this is a survival mechanism. So I do not fault my body for this, not one little bit. My body is tremendously efficient. And so, in the interest of self preservation and preserving glucose, the glucose that I need to live, my body will strip away capacity that, because I'm not communicating with my body that it needs these capacities, my body says goodbye to them, which goes back to our original topic of conversation. How so much of what we attribute to aging is not due to growing older, it's due to spending lots and lots of time doing a very limited number of things with our bodies, and not all of the things that we want our bodies to continue to be able to do as we grow older.
There's there's so much in there about how the body responds, and like the lesson of not treating the body like a wheelchair that the brain rides around on. Like it's just this thing that's supposed to be in service of the mind. The mind and the body are one. Um, Before we go any further, there are like 1,200 posts on your Instagram feed. And one of the things that I found really inspiring was seeing little ideas for movement. And there are a lot of really clever ideas of things that I've seen you do in there that could be a really neat way to add some seasoning to a simple walk, like carry a book with you. You don't have to go buy a kettlebell. You can just take a book, and just having a movement practice where you're moving, but your hands are now my arms have a job other than balance. Now my
Mhm.
arms can do a thing. So there are all these little things that I saw in your movement videos that I thought were really good, maybe for seeding ideas for people. So the first thing I want to say is tell me about Instagram and maybe where people can learn more about you if they wanted to. I know you have online courses and things. Let's do that now while we're here.
Okay, so I am old school moves on Instagram, but it's not the way that you think it's spelled. It's not old school, it's old's cool
Cool.
moves. So I also have a website, www.oldschoolmoves.com. So there's no H in it. That's the
Right.
easy way to remember it. It's not school, it's cool. So I launched recently something that speaks to largely what you're talking about, which I call the 5 minute movement. So it's basically little, sometimes it's just one move, sometimes it's a brief sequence of movements that it might take me a little bit more than 5 minutes to teach, but basically the moving with me would be 5 minutes. And it involves bringing in a whole bunch of different movement competencies and movement
Mm.
practices. So there is this idea of building in a variety of movement. So it's a great way to get started in movement if you haven't been moving, but I think it's also a super way to supplement whatever it is you're doing because all movement modalities have their gaps, which is why I've consciously chosen to be a movement generalist, not a specialist, because I firmly believe that certainly for me, I guess it's temperamental as well. Certainly for me, being a movement generalist is going to serve me better for all of the reasons that we've just talked about, in that my body doesn't get really, really great at some things at the expense of being able to do others. And it's also good for me temperamentally in that if I'm a generalist, I'm not as likely to be tempted by the perfectionism that has characterized so much of my life and
Mm.
that really has not been good for me. So, I like this idea of bringing movement variety in. And so, like, I've tried to create something for people. And of course, people can just follow me on Instagram for free too. But, you know, you get a little bit more of more instruction in these other ways. Um, yeah. So I think that it's largely just becoming more and more aware of how I am right now is going to have an impact on how I experience the right now, but it's also going to have an experience on and sorry an influence on how I experience my future. So a question that I ask people quite frequently is, well, just how do you imagine yourself as an older person?
We like to say, "Oh, I wish I was 20 again." No, you mean you wish you had your 20-year-old body, but how do you see yourself in 10
Yeah,
years? That's a
yeah.
different question
Yeah,
entirely.
it's a much different question. And then I think that it can be really, really quite empowering to help people understand that there is something that they can do about it. So, taking, being grateful for the bodies we have. So, if you're alive, if you're breathing, no matter how old you are, your body has supported you for the entire time that you have been alive and supported you in ways that you're not even
You're
aware
aware
of.
of, right?
So pausing for a moment and being grateful for how our bodies really do support us. And I don't mean to in any way diminish or minimize some of the very difficult and painful health problems that people have. But if we're alive, our bodies are supporting us in some way, and they're actually trying their best. So, pausing for a moment there, but then also being very, very wide eyed and aware of some of the very real things that are going to happen to us as we age, some of the very real physical changes, and what we can do about them. So, for example, loss of muscle mass and changes in muscle composition, loss of bone density, susceptibility to cardiovascular disease, loss of elasticity in the lungs and in the heart, changes in brain mass, um, things that influence um, our ability to react in the world. Well, all of these things are going to happen to us to some degree, but every single one of them can be slowed almost to the point of stillness with physical activity, but only the right kinds of physical activity. So having this wide-eyed view and then asking myself, well, all right, given that this is what aging, what growing old is, then how do I want to grow old? And the answer can and should be different for everybody. So, not everybody has to be the 80-year-old parachuting out of an airplane. And you see people like that set up as paragons of virtue.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great choice for them. But somebody else can lead a very, very meaningful and fulfilling third act or fourth act, even making completely different choices. So it's a question of envisioning the kind of third and fourth act we want for ourselves, and then asking, well, what can I do about it now? Because every single one of us can do something about it now. Every single one of us.
I think in some of the episodes, in episodes of the show, I specifically talk about trying to give people who are listening their next question. And the one that you just said, what can I do about it now, is a brilliant question. So I think if people had a chance to reflect on that, that would be a gateway, I hope, for people to begin to think more about what can they do now. Yeah,
But
go
in
ahead.
two prongs. So I'll go back to what I said earlier, and too much of traditional fitness is fear-based. It's, oh, well, if you don't do this thing now, this terrible thing is going to happen to you later. Well, here you go, Pontiac. It might happen whether or not you do it. So it's a question of being present in the now and finding ways to move that are meaningful for you now, and that aren't bludgeoning you now,
Now.
and that are sometimes, perhaps not always, sometimes leading you to enjoyment, maybe even delight, maybe even something that you discover about yourself, bringing you into a deeper relationship with yourself, with the people around you, with your environment now. But then there's also the eye to the future. So it's two, like, what can you do now should influence the now, and it should also influence the tomorrow. So it's having that shorter term vision and that longer term vision at the same time. So there you go. Two questions in
Mm,
one.
terrific. David, we could talk for hours, but I want to be mindful of your time and people listening. We can always come back for more. I will just say, and of course, the final question, 3 words to describe your practice.
Curiosity. Curiosity, because when I'm curious, I'm looking. And I'm observing all of the things, and I'm looking at possibility, and I'm not married to outcome. So it might very well be that I could have, back to something we were talking about earlier, I might have a loosely defined goal, but if I'm curious about that goal, I don't necessarily get married to it or wrap my self esteem up in it. Instead, I'm just curious about it. Hey, I wonder, what if? It also makes me less judgmental about myself. Like, it's just, okay, like, look at you, you're trying. That's good. How, could you try a little differently? What would happen if you did this? So it's a responsive way of moving through the world, because when you start getting curious about something, the thing that you turn your attention to, the moment you turn your attention to it, your curiosity shifts towards some different aspect of that thing. So curiosity is a way for me to stay engaged. It is a way for me to stay interested and present, noticing what's going on. Not only in relationship to the thing that I might be curious about, but in relationship to myself and how I'm feeling within that exploration. And maybe there's something I can do within that exploration to bring myself into a better relationship with myself, or into a better relationship with the other people who might be also engaged in that activity with me. Which I guess leads me to my second word, which is compassion. So, what does it really mean to show up with love? What does it really mean to love what I do, and to love myself, and to love the people who are engaged in that with me? What does it mean for me to love my life? And how can I show up in a way that is compassionate toward myself, compassionate toward others, in ways that are going to reduce the likelihood that I'm just going to be making myself miserable in what I'm doing? Because most of us have a really great talent for doing that, at least some of the time. And the third word is playfulness, because I think that the whole idea of play has gotten a really bad rap. That, especially, I think, once we, in fact, graduate from whatever we graduate from to do whatever it is we're going to do for a living, we become addicted to competence. And when we become addicted to competence, we become, first of all, too identified with one particular skill set. Our identities become wrapped up in things that we might not even really want to define us. And we lose the capacity to take ourselves a little less seriously. And when we can take ourselves a little less seriously, when we can engage in something not because we expect to be good at it, but because we actually might enjoy it, we can find a whole lot more to be interested in within ourselves, within our relationships, and within the world in which we live. So you can see that playfulness, compassion, and curiosity, they're really very, very closely interrelated in that they assist each other. So when I can bring a playful attitude, that helps me be more curious, and it also helps me be more compassionate. If I can be more compassionate toward myself, I can let go of this addiction to competence and just let myself try and suck. So I have come to embrace the idea that if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing badly and playfully. So I like those three words, and they're almost one word all wrapped up together, but they happen to be teased out into three different threads. So those are my three words, and yeah, I've really enjoyed being here today.
Terrific. I was contemplating starting us by talking about play, but I'm like, no, no, no. I'm pretty sure that we'll get to it at the end. I'm glad that we managed to cover as much ground as we did. We've talked about a bunch of really important, really deep things. Really appreciate your taking the time to unpack and to follow the trains of thought, through to some depth, what we can manage. I hope people take a chance to read. I have one book that I have to go read now, but at least I know This Chair Rocks is an excellent book. I recommend reading that one. And I hope people find something in here that makes them go, wait, what? Tell me more. Go look up more of David's work, reach out to him, scroll down. It's all in the show notes. Thanks again, David, so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me.